If you have ever expressed interest in real estate investing, you have almost certainly been hit with objections about how it's a major risk and the possibility of losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. But with that in mind, a survey from LendingTree found that out of 2,000 Americans, 45% of them said that real estate was the #1 way to build wealth, followed by 32% responding with the stock market. But in practice, only 14% of the respondents actually invest in real estate outside of their primary residence, and 33% of them investing in the stock market. I think one of the reasons there is such a big disconnect between belief and practice is the perception that while it does have the best return, it must also carry the greatest risk. So in this video, I'm going to cover what the risks of real estate investing are, with the best tips to reduce them and protect your investment. Obviously, there are a ton of ways to lose money investing in real estate, but they will almost always stem from either selling at a loss, experiencing negative cash flow, which just means you're losing money on a monthly basis, or being involved in a lawsuit. So this video will be the first part of this series. I'll cover how to mitigate the risk of selling at a loss. This is probably the most common way people lose money in real estate. So let's go through the reasons someone could be forced to sell a property for less than what they bought it for. One reason would be their loan is either being called due or readjusting. So that means when they bought the property, the investor and the lender agreed to a balloon payment. A balloon payment is when the remaining balance of the loan is due in full. For example, if you bought a property for $200,000 and put $40,000 down, you could have a fixed interest rate for 30 years with a balloon payment in 10. So your original loan amount would be $160,000 and your mortgage payment would be based on a 30-year term. But at the end of 10 years, you would be responsible for paying the loan back in full. So you would need to pay the lender back the remaining loan balance of $134,000. But if it is not favorable to refinance the loan before the balloon payment is due, the investor will be forced to sell the property to pay the loan off or pay the $134,000 loan balance off and keep the property. But if they do not have the money to pay off the loan and the value of the property has dropped since it's been bought, they will be forced to sell at a loss. The loan readjusting is similar, but instead of the loan being called due, the interest rate just adjusts. For example, you can have a 30-year loan term that's fixed for the first 5 years and then starts adjusting after 5 years. So if the first interest rate is 5.5%, but then after 5 years, the loan readjusts to 8%, the entire first 5 years, your mortgage payment would be $900. And then right at the 5-year mark, your mortgage payment would jump up to $1,350. So if the rent didn't go up $450 in that time frame to cover the higher mortgage payment, and you couldn't come up with this difference out of pocket yourself, you could potentially be forced to sell the property. The way to avoid this problem is simple. Either only use fixed rate mortgages with no balloon payments, and the good news is almost all residential loans, meaning properties with 4 units or less, have 30-year fixed rate mortgages. If you are using a commercial loan or seller financing, make the balloon payment or rate adjustment far enough out that you are confident you can refinance or sell for a profit at that point. Let's say in Q1 of 2006, you bought the median home at $247,000 and got a mortgage with a balloon payment in 3 years. If you had to sell here in Q1 of 2009, you would lose around $50,000. But if you made your balloon payment for 10 years and were forced to sell here in Q1 of 2016, you would be able to sell for around $50,000 more than what you bought it for. So I would try to always give yourself at least 7 years of a fixed rate mortgage with no balloon payment, because the odds of the property's value decreasing over that time frame are very small. Another reason you may be forced to sell at a loss is you can no longer afford the monthly mortgage. When you own a property, there will be maintenance required. Things will break, and even more so when it's a rental. And when the tenant moves out, you will have a vacancy, meaning you are collecting no rent, but you are still on the hook for the mortgage payments, taxes, and insurance. On top of that, when a tenant moves out is when you'll have your highest maintenance costs, because you will discover deferred maintenance when getting the property ready for the new tenant. This is also your opportunity to replace big ticket items that are old and at the end of their working life while the property is empty. You don't want to replace the AC unit or kitchen appliances when you have a tenant living in the property if you don't have to. For when the property is filled, make sure you plan for it to cash flow by itself from the rent alone. So if you lose your job or no longer have an income stream to pay for the mortgage, you aren't forced to sell in a bad position. The best way to mitigate not being able to afford the mortgage from becoming a problem is to be conservative with your underwriting. Assume rent will be a little bit lower than market and expenses will be a little bit more than you expect. That way, if you are ever having trouble finding a tenant, you can always drop the rent a little bit if you have to. Also, when you are deciding if the property can cash flow or not, make sure to account at least 15% of the rent going toward maintenance maintenance and vacancy. This means every month you will put 15% of the rent away because you know at some point you will have a vacancy and repairs that need to be done. This ensures you will be prepared to pay for them and not forced to sell. And that 15% every month is on top of always keeping at least 6 months of expenses in reserves per property you own. Ideally, you will never have to touch the 6 months of reserves, and the 15% you save every month will be able to cover your vacancy and repairs whenever they happen. Another good general way to avoid selling at a loss is buying at a discount. If you buy a property at a discount and improve it to make it worth more, it gives you that built-in equity cushion. So if you are unfortunately forced to sell the property, you will be able to make a profit instead of losing money. The third reason you may have to sell at a loss is running out of money for the rehab. This is self-explanatory. If you don't have money to finish getting the property ready for a tenant or for sale, then you will be forced to sell at a loss because you're selling an unfinished house quickly, while at the same time as spending more money on the rehab than originally planned. There are multiple ways to mitigate this from happening. First, include a 10-day as-is inspection contingency in your offer. Have your inspector and contractor go through the property, if possible, together. Once you have the inspection report back, add anything that you or your contractor may have missed into the scope of work, and get written bids for everything that needs to be done. This all needs to be completed before the 10-day inspection period is up. If your written bids from your contractor are more than you expected when you made your original offer, you need to inform the seller of this and renegotiate the price based on the new rehab budget that has been set. If they do not agree to lowering the price, you will be able to walk out of the contract without losing your earnest money deposit. The seller does not have this option of backing out. They just have the choice of whether they want to lower the original offer price or not. So it is risk-free to renegotiate with the seller as long as the new price is agreed upon before the 10-day inspection period has expired, or you have either terminated the contract before 10 days. And again, always be conservative with these bids. Assume everything will be a little bit more than what is in the contract. Also, don't forget to factor in the holding costs during the rehab. If you have a hard money loan, you will have that payment to make, but even if you bought the property in cash, don't forget to factor in the taxes, insurance, and utility costs before the property is done and ready for the tenant. The last rehab tip to think about is the smaller the renovation, the less room for error. If the rehab is only cosmetic, the less permits, materials, and labor need to be bought, meaning overall less odds for the bids to be significantly different than what was expected. Plus, if you are not opening walls or doing foundation repairs, the less likely you are to come across more defects in the property like leaks or rotted wood that need to be fixed. I'm not saying stay away from major rehabs, just be extra conservative when buying those kinds of properties and expect for those things to come up. And the fourth reason you may have to sell at a loss is having a bad tenant. Having a good tenant is overall the best way to protect yourself from losing money in real estate investing. Part 2 is going over how to avoid negative cash flow, and having a good tenant is a huge part of that as well. The main way a bad tenant can force you to sell your property at a loss is for them to damage the property more than what the security deposit covers. In Virginia, the maximum amount of security deposit a landlord can hold is 2 months worth of rent. So if the tenant damages exceed your security deposit amount, you're responsible for either paying the cost yourself or suing the tenant, which is definitely possible, but the type of person that damages your property that badly probably doesn't have much for you to go after. And even if you did get some money back, you run the risk of the attorney fees being a larger expense than if you just fixed the property in the first place. So you can really get stuck between a rock and a hard place. For example, let's say you finally saved up $50,000 for your first investment. You bought a $200,000 property and put $40,000 down and kept $10,000 in reserves. You then place a tenant in the property and collect a $3,000 security deposit. But then they completely destroyed the property, causing $20,000 worth of damages and lowering the value to $160,000. Since you don't have the reserves or security deposit to fix the damages for a new tenant, you are forced to either potentially increase your losses with attorney fees trying to sue the tenant, or just cut your losses at $50,000 once you add on closing costs to selling the property. In my opinion, this is the biggest risk to real estate investing. But fortunately, there are many ways to combat this through tenant screening. I would suggest using a property management company to help you find the tenant. Property managers should have an entire process that they can explain to you that they put the tenant through before approving them. If they cannot explain that to you, find a new one. Property managers should perform credit checks, employment verification, if any previous evictions or lawsuits have been filed against them, criminal background check, and income verification. If you are not going to use a property manager, you will need to perform all of these checks yourself to minimize the risk of a tenant causing excessive damage. On top of extensive tenant screening is buying in a good location. Almost everyone I know of that has had a tenant destroy their property has been in a D-class neighborhood. Avoid areas that have a lot of crime and poor school ratings. The best tenants that will take care of your property want to live in the best neighborhoods they can afford. So if you're wondering what those neighborhoods are in Richmond that are still affordable enough for rentals, here are 6 safe suburbs where you can buy properties for under $250,000. And if you need help buying, selling, or investing in real estate, my information will be in the description.